Hello, everyone. Welcome to this series of interviews with cybersecurity experts. I am Tasheva, your host, CEO of Cyen. And today we're happy to welcome Kaevin Rombaut. He's subject matter expert on operational and IT risk management. Welcome, Kaevin.
Thank you, Eva. Happy to be here.
We have had the chance to work with Kaevin on different projects as well as to stay together in the Brussels community. So I know a little bit about your experience, but I'm very thankful for you coming to share with the broader audience. The topic that we selected together to discuss is hitting the ground running. How can we navigate EU cybersecurity legislation with risk-based approach and proportionality in mind? But this might come as a very expert talk, right? Risk-based approach and proportionality might seem different to people coming from different backgrounds. What is it? What does it mean, this principle, in the context of EU cybersecurity regulation?
Well, it's if you look at the regulations a bit across even outside of IT, the regulator uses a lot the fact that companies can or need to be compliant with regulation in a proportional manner, proportional to their size or complexity, something like that. What is important for companies to retain, and what I've experienced in the past is if companies consider themselves as smaller, they can say, well, this is less applicable, so we're not going to apply on that or well, apply a certain measure. And that's why I want to emphasize on the fact that proportionality is not an excuse to not be compliant. Every company, so the legislation, the regulation is what it is. You need to be compliant with the aspects which apply to you. But of course, not everybody has to build a Rolls Royce in order to make sure that they are compliant to new regulations. And that's where proportionality kicks in. I always compare it to, for example, within traffic, if you drive a heavy truck, an 18-wheeler, you need a system of braking that is, or of brakes that is really robust, because if you're not able to brake in time, you will cause massive damage. If you only drive a car, you also need brakes, but they're smaller. So the fact that you need brakes is going to be applicable whether you're big or small. It's just the complexity of the measure that you put in place has to be in line with your scale and what you're doing. So I think that's where the proportionality principle is important to consider. And every company has to determine that for themselves. The regulator doesn't say what is small, what is large. Well, in some aspects, they do give some guidelines on that. But that proportionality on whether or not you have to apply it big or small is up to you. And to define whether you are large and complex, I think your complexity starts with an analysis of what you're doing, of your services that you're offering, of the activities that you're offering, and I think that's the starting point to evaluate whether some conditions are applicable or not. And that's why I think hitting the ground running is a good title, because in fact, I don't believe that companies are starting from scratch. Regulations come up usually when there has been an incident, or at least the external environment is changing that much that the exposure to a certain risk is that elevated that regulators see it as their task to actually impose regulation on companies so that they apply the bare minimum, or at least the measures to avoid a risk of becoming or of materializing. And that's why, for example, within organizations, especially in the financial sector as well, you have, for example, business impact assessments, which I would assume most have in place because it has been a regulatory requirement for quite some time. And that can be the basis of defining what is critical for you as a company and for you as a financial services player. And if you look at that, in principle, you have already defined what activities you have in-house, which activities are critical and which are not. I think that's a very good baseline.
Yes, you touch upon a few points. You mentioned the regulation comes not as some extravagant requirement. The regulation is just there to enforce something that is considered to be the norm, right? And for some reason, actors, big or small, are lagging behind, depending on different sectors. But it's very important to highlight that in a way, it's necessary for the regulator to also put this kind of flexibility in the regulation, because the cybersecurity legislation we have in mind, both of us, I think, when we discuss this topic, is obviously the DORA, the Digital Operation Resilience Act, focusing indeed on enforcing the security or the requirements for digital resilience based on the size, complexity, and risk profile of the organization, indeed. But we also have other cybersecurity legislations like NIS2, which is a little bit broader scope, definitely much broader than the financial sector. It covers, I think, 17 specific sectors. And it could not be the same measure for all of them. One cannot define a common standard that applies to energy. Think of nuclear power plant. That's the same as digital service providers. So it's very different environments, very different risk profiles, threats, needs as well, operational needs. But at the same time, the same level of security should apply. The same regulation, at least, applies to those contexts. So it's a necessary requirement, flexibility to make it work in different contexts. But as you said, it's not an excuse not to implement.
And what I think
it's applicable, right? Yeah.
Of course, and of course, companies who need to apply to the fullest extent and with what I just said, the Rolls Royce of measure. Regulators have already defined the critical infrastructure which is in place. There are rules on that which is critical. So if you as a company are considered critical, it might already ring a bell that you might need to do something more than others who have less exposure. Like I said, the big truck on the road, if it has an accident, there's going to be more than one car who's going to be hit and more than one person who's going to be impacted. If you only drive a small car, you hit another car, there might be a whiplash. Might be worse as well, but it's going to be less impactful as the large corporations which need service a lot of people. So again, there we come to that assessment of what is the criticality of my services.
When we speak about criticality, it rings a bell also that adequacy. So the adequate measure and the risk base is also very strongly enforced, not only on the type of sector and activities you have, but also on the type of data you manage. I'm thinking of the GDPR. Again, the EU GDPR implementing the adequate security measures, right? That need to be enforcing at least such a requirement. So it's probably a matrix of considerations that one has to take into account, and all of them are in a way logical. So it doesn't come again from someone's wish. It is at the end aimed to reinforce the resilience and the security of all of us as ecosystem and as society. But how can an individual organization identify what could possibly be their proportionate or adequate security measures, knowing that their role is not only of organization protecting themselves, but often about protecting supply chain, protecting individuals, their clients, protecting also the economy?
The adequacy of controls is first on defining which to put in place. That's one thing. To actually know whether they are adequate is being enforced by testing. or can be enforced by testing. You need to test whether your controls are actually sufficient to cover a certain extent of risk. And depending on what you want to test, it's possible to do that. For example, resilience, because we both are working on the topic of DORA quite a bit. You can test whether or not you are able to restore your activities from the ground up at a certain point in time. And to do that, you test whether you're, well, you actually do a real life test and you see whether your activities can be rebooted within the time frame that you define, which is feasible and which is acceptable. And I think many organizations already do some kind of testing like this. So, for example, disaster recovery testing that they do is you have different types of testing, but what I see in the larger corporations is they actually do real life tests. They actually work on a full other set of IT infrastructure and test whether it's working. So put one site out and work on the other one. It's also been a regulatory requirement for a while, and you see that testing works. And sometimes I hear people say that, well, a test was not successful, and it always frustrates me a bit because the fact that you test showed you that you have some gaps in your control, some improvements to be made. So the testing as such is a good point. Make sure that you test so that you can identify the improvement points that you still need to work on, and make sure that you tackle those in the future. So the testing is the most the best way of finding out whether or not you are you have adequate controls in place. If you have, for example, encryption or user access management, or you want to test your internal controls and your internal security measures, well, then you ask for penetration testing to be done. You can for vulnerabilities, well, you just scan your vulnerability. So the testing is something which can be done quite easily. Monitoring is well, same thing. I had an interesting discussion some time ago on people stating that we have an alarm in place. And the alarm is in place because I see on my screen that my alarm is on. And I said, well, perfect. And how do you know that, well, nobody broke in the meanwhile? Did you test it? Will the alarm effectively go off when somebody breaks your door? And that was like a kind of something that they didn't consider because they felt so safe that they put a control in place, which has cost money because they actually put quite some budget in there. But in the end, how do you know that it's effective? And the only way to do that is to actually make sure that you see the alarm going off. So that's again a possible control of adequacy. To test and to monitor that level of adequacy is something that you need to define organization per organization. You can test things once a month, once every 6 months, once a year. It also depends a bit on which means and resources you have in place. But at least the regulation defines a mandatory minimum frequency in which you need to test your controls. And organizations can deviate from that, which is very nice. But of course, you cannot deviate and say, well, I'm going to do it once every 2 years instead of once every year. No, you can be more strict, but you cannot be less strict. And I think that's again, where that proportionality comes into play, and where I said you need to comply, is because smaller companies will have to have that minimum frequency, but probably the regulator will require a bit more from larger, systemically important or critical infrastructure.
You mentioned already that testing, first, the frequency is also one level of risk-based approach to identify what is the risk of something. The status of what you know has changed, right? Because it's a organizations are changing, people are changing, technology is changing, and sometimes things just stop working, right? So that's also something to consider in your adequacy risk-based approach decision. But this could be one challenge for companies to test, because it's not only, many companies already face the challenge of applying some security measures, right? And then testing it, it's another level of maturity and getting meaningful results of these tests. As you said, I check the small light is on, everything is fine. Well, that's not always meaningful check, right? What are the biggest challenges you see companies face applying a risk-based approach to compliance?
Every rule is there, and we need to be compliant with the rule if it applies to the activity that we have. And the risk-based side that you mentioned, I think is important, because when you say risk-based, you say risk management. And if you do a risk assessment, you define your exposure to a certain risk, your controls in place, and what do I have left as a certain level of risk. And risk management is there to assist management, the business management, to make decisions in order for them to stay within a certain risk appetite that they defined. Now, from a business point of view, I think it's important to note that regulators have the interests of the end client at heart. They want to make sure that the client is protected and that the services offered by any market participant in nearly any industry is up to a certain level and complying to certain standards. Now, companies, they have more than just that. Companies have other stakeholders than the regulator. They have suppliers that they need to take into account. But of course, their main stakeholder for many of them is their shareholder as well. And in the end, they need to be profitable. So everything is a question of, where do I allocate my resources? Where are my biggest risks, and where do I need to allocate my resources the most? And I think the biggest challenge for companies is really making that balance between the resources that they have available to invest and to make sure that their client have the best experience on the level of security, as well as on the level of innovation and customer experience. They need to make that balance on where do we invest. It's a saying, don't put all your eggs in the same basket. Here it's the same. You need to make sure that that you comply and that you are secure for the activities which are most critical and for which you have the most risk exposure. So there we come again into that first step of defining what are my critical activities, where do I need to put my attention the most. And defining those activities, like we said with the business impact assessment, defining those activities is just step one. After that, you need to define what is supporting those activities in terms of IT, but also in terms of suppliers, for example. And there, I think it's an interesting difference between larger corporations or smaller corporations, where, for example, the smaller ones need to outsource and they focus on their core business, and the other ones, they have more and more of activities internally or managed internally. So you see that focus of where do I need to invest shifting from that company which works with suppliers. They need to put more on supplier monitoring. They need to put more on audits. They need to put more on making sure that the activity, that what they get as a service from their supplier is in line with that regulation. Because in the end, it's not the supplier who is accountable to be compliant. It's you as a company who needs to be compliant. The regulator is not going to come to your supplier and ask, tell me, why did you do this? They are going to come to you, and you need that. You need to have that response ready. So there, the challenges will be different depending on the focus that you need to put on internal measures or suppliers. Where I think from a strategic point of view, there's going to be interesting discussions as well, because suppliers, if you have a supplier supporting a critical activity, that supplier will have to be a partner. It needs to be more than just someone that you pay for the hours that they worked for you or for the services that they've made available. You need to, the regulation now is what it is. DORA has come out, but in 2019 you had the guidelines on being on ICT risk management and well, security, which already laid down a lot of the rules which now come back in DORA. So DORA is not new on many aspects, but they are more precise, clear, and of course a bit more a bit larger than what it was. But that shows that you need to be future-proof. You need to build your system and your foundations in such a way that they are flexible to adapt in the future to more strict controls. I would say more strict or less strict, but probably it's going to be more strict. And you need to be able to adapt to that environment. So that challenge will be there as well, to define the solution that that makes you future-proof, that makes you able to cope with changing regulations in the future.
Indeed, you touch upon a few things. So you touch upon the role of audits, and we will get back to it. But you also spoke about the evolution of regulation, how eventually it's not brand new. It's something, let's say, the seeds that we had that are now fruiting with more details and stronger, probably, visibility and enforcement. And you also spoke about the agile organization, business decisions, shareholders. So can businesses really stay agile and compliant in this rapidly changing environment in Europe, at least? Or yes or no? Maybe you would answer as a lawyer, it depends, and then
It
you would lay
depends.
out our conditions. So what is your assessment? Is it possible or not possible?
I think they can. The one does not exclude the other. I think what I just stated on making sure that the solutions that you use are future-proof and are able to be scalable and be flexible, that will allow you in the future to actually more rapidly respond to changing environments. And you see a lot of in financial services, not only that regulation is only going to be more demanding than what they are now. It's not going to be less stringent.
Well, depends. Maybe in the US it will be less stringent.
Yeah.
Nothing is impossible.
Of course, yeah, you have a point. So then we come on the fact, will we still be competitive in that area as well? But indeed,
one has to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. That's what I was told, and that's how I acted.
Let's hope that we don't get into situations like that, because I think the protection of the end customer and of the people as a whole is the most important thing that we need to do. And you need regulation. You need the regulation to be in place to actually govern life as it is. And when we talk about the regulation in our area of expertise, it's one thing. But if you don't have any speed limits anymore and anybody can do whatever they want, I'm not sure that is where we want to go. So it's not going to create a safe environment. But about agility, I think the regulatory evolution over the past years has been quite intense, and you see that projects or investments to be compliant are they are the most there are in some cases the most demanding. They're on the top budgets of companies investment scheme, and you see that we had some catching up to do over the past years. There was little regulation that was taken to place, and perhaps it was too little. And I think we are now becoming more and more mature. Also, regulators are becoming more and more mature in defining ways to make it feasible and still make it workable for companies. So the agility and an agile way of working means setting priorities. Now, there is no choice of being compliant or not compliant, but there are choices that can be made on do you want to go for a full-blown solution now, or do we go in steps and make sure that we're compliant, but we move along in steps, and you take your business along. So I think we don't have to fear that businesses will not be creative or innovative in the future because of regulation. I think it will go hand in hand. Regulation is also asking for they're asking to put in place trust, that you show to your customers that you are trustworthy, and that they can put their business into your hands. And I think that alone helps you as a company also business-wise to give a value proposition to your customer. Look, this is what we have in place. The regulation asks this. We offer this, plus we go a step further. I think that trust is becoming quite important for corporations in any industry. So if you can show that you're a trustworthy partner, your business will flourish as well.
And what can better improve trust than an audit? And
Yeah.
and ideally also avoiding trust spoilers like big incidents. But what is your view of the role of audits, incident reporting, and penalties in ensuring compliance? Do you see them as race to the bottom just to cover, or do you see them as an active, agile instrument to enforce and measure performance?
Well, for regulators, they are the instruments that they have. I had an interesting conversation a couple weeks ago on incident reporting as well, because regulators have that incident reporting in play. In DORA, you will need to have it in place. And that
Just to
means
mention, it's not only DORA. NIS2 has it, Cyber
it.
Resilience Act has it, and GDPR had it for many years now, 6-7 years. So that is not completely new. It's more maybe expanding in scope.
It is expanding in scope. That's a sure thing. And that incident reporting, I think, if you are a regulator and you know and you receive that reporting on your side, and you see that overall, if you take medium-sized enterprises, we get 10, 20 incidents per year. And then you see one which sends you one or two. I think it will be it's an instrument that they use to, for example, pay a visit to that company and see how are you organized. Because I think an incident, having an incident is not a good thing. So it's preferable that you don't have them. But having an incident, reporting them, and showing how you cope with it and resolving them, and making sure that you have lessons learned and that you follow up the actions that come from that, show to regulators that you have an organization which has a framework in place and which has a certain way of working to make sure that incidents don't repeat itself. Now, if as a company you don't report to regulators might come and see, and how come that everyone in the industry is reporting incidents, and apparently at your side you're working perfectly. So I think the audit will allows regulators to have a deeper understanding on how a company works, and they will come with certain recommendations to help you comply. Audits are, of course, always a burden on companies. The audit requires quite some time of every specialist that is involved in a certain area, and they will need to help the auditors understand how they work. Evidences will need to be supplied. There's a lot of conversations, a lot of assessments which need to be performed by the auditors, but also in cooperation with the business and with the experts at hand. So being audited is not necessarily a bad thing because it will help you forward. It will identify some weaknesses or some things that need to be improved. But that's what the regulator works with. Now, penalties is a last resort. Even regulators don't like to penalize, or they don't like to fine people. It's always good, of course, to help the Belgian state, in my case, get a bit more funding, but it's not the final purpose of a regulator to put penalties in place. Usually in all cases, regulators will first look at what your environment is, give you a recommendation, give you time to actually implement, do whatever is necessary to be compliant. And if there is, if at a certain point you pass their level of risk appetite, then they will probably move on to a certain fine. But I think it's necessary. I think to enforce a certain regulation, you need to have those measures in place. It's like when you drive the highway, if you pass the speed limit, if they don't verify that everybody follows that rule and fine you, yeah, there's going to be quite some people not following the rules that they were stated.
Yes, I'm thinking because you mentioned, of course, the police, you know, the standard life that we all live in, but there it's a little bit segregated, right? You have the law enforcement, which just enforces the rule, and then you have the legislature that would normally define the rules. In theory, that makes it a little bit less biased, because it is possible as a regulator, you define the rule that no one follows, you may want to consider changing the rule rather than penalizing everyone. So there's always this question, is it too hard? Is the rule adequate, right?
Yeah.
When, also deciding to penalize an organization. But indeed, your idea of, and this ties very well with what you mentioned in the beginning, let's not forget the regulators put the rules to increase trust. Trust of users, trust within the economy, and especially when it comes to supply chain security, that's an instrument that could really act in scale. And penalty is not one that necessarily increase trust. So again, it's a failure of the regulation. It's not the objective. But as you rightfully pointed out, if there is no consequence, there is less incentives to follow the game. Okay, and do you think that regulators, knowing how complex the organizations and interactions are already, we discussed how difficult it is to assess the adequacy and the risk within an organization. Do you think regulators are equipped, or would they have the instruments necessary to adequately also assess the adequacy of these measures, not only relying on incidents, hopefully, but also on assessment?
I used to be in the beginning of my career, I was an auditor. And the advantage of being an auditor is that you can ask stupid questions to people. Well, stupid questions, no question is stupid, but you can ask basic questions to people to actually actively learn how they function. And regulators also, they gather a lot of information before they actually start auditing or start going into companies to see whether or not they mitigate their risks sufficiently. For example, before regulations come out, that was the case for GDPR, it was the case for guidelines on outsourcing and ICT risk management as well. They first publish a draft, then companies get the chance to actually ask questions, comments, and say, this is too far. Do we interpret? Do we have the good interpretation of certain rules, etc.? And there already they can get some feeling of Where is this going? What is the industry thinking? What is it? What is proportionate? What is a measure which would be acceptable and limit the risk, or what is too much? And I think that's the first step that they do before the regulation is being published as final. Once it is being published as a final regulation, it doesn't stop. So the regulator in a banking industry, at least they ask for feedback. They actually send out questionnaires and they make sure that they understand, okay, where are we? Where are the challenges today? Where are you gonna be? So as a company, you fill it in to the best of your knowledge. And there's 100 other companies who fill it in as well. So that means that the regulator has 100 views of where companies struggle. So they can already tailor their approach on verifications, on audits, on being very strict on certain points and less strict on others, based upon that. And I think the regulator also takes into account that learning curve that companies go through, well, each and every one of them. I think there's a good aspect of continuous improvement. Well, also for regulation, there is an aspect of continuous improvement. Nobody needs to be perfect as of day one. It's something that you build up. And I think regulators there as well, they take that into account, and they have a lot of instruments with which they gather information on a current status within the environment.
No, indeed. Now that we're coming to conclusion of this interview, it hits me again that it boils down to the fact that everything is possible and the risk base and the adequacy, but there's no one solution, right? There's a lot of stakeholders that need to be considered when defining what's adequate, what is risk-based decision. And it's not only regulators, it's not only the law that is an input. You also have the stakeholders, the shareholders, you have the clients. You spoke about the business interests. You also want to make sure you produce products that are not purely secure. They also have to be functional, they have to be innovative, they have to be affordable. So in a way, security indeed is one, let's say, property of your product, and it has to fit well the ecosystem and the other objectives of the discussion. And it reminds me of the interview with Anne Leslie, where we discussed extensively the DORA and how it is required to have a very good conversations and collaboration between the different teams to get there, to finally boil down what is adequate at this point of time for this specific organization. But thank you so much, Kaevin. I learned a lot. It was interesting to hear your perspective, and I invite everyone to follow up the conversation, subscribe to our YouTube channel for content like this and new interviews, but also feel free to share your own experience, knowledge, or if you have any question in the comment section. Thank you.